Blue lights flash in your rearview mirror. Your chest tightens a little, even if you haven't done anything wrong. You slow down, pull over, and before you've even fully processed what's happening, the officer is already walking up to your window. You roll it down halfway. He leans slightly forward, calm but observant, and after the usual request for license and registration, he asks a question that feels simple on the surface, but carries a lot more weight than most people realize. Do you have any weapons in the vehicle? Now let me ask you something before we go any further. What did you say the last time an officer asked you a question like that during a traffic stop? Drop your answer in the comments, because your instinctive response matters more than you probably think. And stick with me, because later I'm going to explain why even a perfectly innocent answer can quietly shift the entire direction of that stop without you noticing it in the moment. Here's the part most drivers don't fully understand. That question is not just about weapons, it's about control, safety, legal positioning, and observation, all happening at once. When an officer asks, "Do you have any weapons?" they are doing several things simultaneously. They're assessing risk, yes, but they're also watching how you respond. Your tone, your hesitation, your eye movement, even how quickly you answer, it all feeds into their perception of you. And that perception can influence everything that happens next. Most people think the goal is to sound cooperative. That's where things start to go sideways. Because in trying to sound cooperative, drivers often talk too much. They say things like, "No, I don't have anything like that, just my gym bag and some tools in the trunk. Nothing dangerous, though." Or worse, they nervously laugh and say, "No weapons, officer, I'm not that kind of person." That might feel harmless. It might even feel polite. But from a legal and practical standpoint, you've just opened doors that didn't need to be opened. Let me walk you into a more realistic moment. You're sitting there. The officer asks the question again, maybe a little slower this time. "Any weapons in the vehicle?" There's a pause, not long, just enough to make you aware of it. That pause is intentional. Officers are trained to let silence do some of the work. People tend to fill silence, and when they do, they often reveal more than they intended. Now here's where the 5 words come in. I don't answer questions. That's it. Simple, calm, clear. And before you think that sounds rude or confrontational, it's not, if you say it the right way. Tone is everything. If you snap it back defensively, you escalate tension. If you say it calmly, almost neutrally, it lands very differently. I don't answer questions. No attitude, no sarcasm, no added explanation. And then you stop talking. That's the part most people mess up. They say the right words, and then they immediately undo it by continuing to speak. "Well, I just don't really feel comfortable answering, but no, I don't have anything." That defeats the purpose entirely. Now let's be honest about something. The officer is probably not going to just accept that answer and move on. In many real-world stops, what happens next is repetition. Why not? Is there a reason you don't want to answer? Are you hiding something? This is where psychological pressure starts to build, and this is where people crack, not because they're guilty, but because they feel awkward, uncomfortable, or even slightly intimidated. The average driver isn't used to holding silence in a situation like this. It feels unnatural. It feels like you're doing something wrong, even when you're not. So they start talking again. And every extra sentence increases the chance of giving the officer something they can use to extend the stop, ask more questions, or justify further investigation. Here's something else you need to understand about how officers think during these stops. They are not just listening to your words, they are building a narrative in real time. If you answer quickly and clearly, that gets noted. If you hesitate, that gets noted. If you over-explain, that definitely gets noted. Even something as subtle as saying, "No, not really," instead of a clean "no," can raise eyebrows. Why? Because "not really" sounds uncertain, and uncertainty triggers curiosity. Curiosity leads to more questions. More questions can lead to requests, like asking you to step out of the vehicle. Let's pause there, because that's another moment where people get caught off guard. An officer can legally ask you to step out of the vehicle during a traffic stop. It doesn't necessarily mean you're in trouble, but it does change the dynamics of the situation. Now you're outside the car. The officer has more control over the environment. They might position you away from your vehicle. They might start asking questions again, this time with a slightly different tone. Anything illegal in the car? Mind if I take a quick look? And if earlier in the stop you were already talking too much, you've likely given them a reason, however small, to keep pushing. This is why those 5 words matter more than they seem. They set a boundary early. They signal that you understand your rights without being aggressive about it. But let me be very clear about something, because this is where people get confused. Saying, "I don't answer questions," does not mean the stop ends immediately. It does not mean the officer walks away. It simply limits the amount of voluntary information you provide. And that matters, because many traffic stops don't escalate because of what officers find initially. They escalate because of what drivers say. Now, let's talk about a situation that happens more often than people realize. You say, "I don't answer questions." The officer pauses, maybe looks at you a little differently. Then they shift strategy. "Okay, do you have anything in the car I should know about?" It sounds like a different question, but it's really the same thing dressed differently. This is where consistency becomes important. If you answer the first question but not the second, you've created inconsistency. And inconsistency is something officers pay attention to. So again, calm tone. "I don't answer questions." Same words, same delivery, no variation. Now, some people worry that this makes them look suspicious. Here's the reality. From an officer's perspective, almost anything can look suspicious depending on context. Talking too much can look suspicious. Being too quiet can look suspicious. Avoiding eye contact can look suspicious. Making too much eye contact can look suspicious. So trying to act normal is not as reliable as people think. What matters more is being consistent and controlled. Let me give you a scenario that might hit close to home. You're pulled over for something minor, maybe a broken tail light or rolling through a stop sign. The officer starts casual. "Where are you coming from tonight?" It feels like small talk. It feels harmless. So you answer, "Just coming back from a friend's house." "Where does your friend live?" Across town." "Which part?" Now you're in a conversation you didn't plan to have. And if at any point your answers are vague, inconsistent, or just slightly off, the officer has a reason, again, even a small one, to keep digging. That's how simple stops turn into longer ones. That's how people end up waiting on the side of the road for 20, 30, even 40 minutes. Not because they did something serious, but because they kept talking. Now let's circle back to the weapons question, because there's an important layer most people miss. In some states, there are laws about disclosing firearms if you're carrying legally. This is where things get nuanced. If you are legally required to disclose, then you must follow that law. But notice the difference between a legal obligation and a general question. The phrase, "Do you have any weapons?" is broad. It's not always the same as a legal disclosure requirement, and this is where understanding your specific state laws becomes critical. Because handling that situation incorrectly, either by saying too much or by misunderstanding your obligation, can create real legal problems. Now let me take you into a more tense moment. You've said, "I don't answer questions." The officer steps back slightly, maybe looks at your car a little longer than before. Then they ask, "Do you mind if I search the vehicle?" This is where everything you've done up to this point matters, because if you've been talking freely, joking, explaining, trying to be overly friendly, it becomes much harder to suddenly draw a firm line. But if you've been consistent from the beginning, it's easier to say, "I do not consent to searches." Different phrase, same principle. Clear, calm, no extra words. And then silence again. Now here's something that might make you uncomfortable, but it's important. Even if you do everything right, the stop can still become stressful. The officer might hold your documents longer than expected. They might go back to their vehicle and take their time. They might come back and ask the same questions again, slightly reworded. This isn't always about you specifically. It's part of how some stops are conducted. Time, repetition, and pressure can cause people to change their answers. And when answers change, even slightly, that can be used to justify further action. So the key is not just knowing what to say, but being able to stick with it under pressure. That's harder than it sounds, because in that moment, you're not sitting comfortably watching a video. You're on the side of the road, possibly with other cars passing by, maybe with a passenger looking at you, maybe feeling judged or nervous. Your instincts will tell you to ease the tension, to just answer the question, to make it go away faster. But ironically, that's often what makes it last longer. Let's talk about passengers for a second, because this adds another layer people don't always think about. An officer might turn to your passenger and ask them similar questions. Do you know if there are any weapons in the car? Now you've got two people under pressure. If your passenger starts answering freely while you're trying to stay quiet, that creates a mismatch. And again, inconsistency becomes a factor. So if you're driving with others, it's worth having this conversation ahead of time. Not in a paranoid way, just in a practical, informed way. Because in real-world stops, these small details matter more than people expect. And here's something else I want you to think about. Officers are trained to maintain control of the interaction. That doesn't mean they're trying to trap you at every moment, but it does mean they are guiding the flow of the conversation. If you allow yourself to be pulled into that flow without thinking, you lose control over what you're saying. Those 5 words, "I don't answer questions," are not about being difficult. They're about maintaining a boundary in a situation where most people don't realize they even need one. And once you understand that, you start to see these stops differently. You start to notice how quickly a simple question can lead to a chain of events. You start to recognize the subtle shifts in tone, timing, and phrasing. And most importantly, you start to realize how much of the outcome depends on what you say, or don't say, in those first few minutes. Because by the time things escalate, it's often too late to undo what's already been said. So, next time you see those blue lights, and that question comes your way, you won't be guessing. You won't be scrambling to figure out the right answer in the moment. You'll already know it. And more importantly, you'll understand why it matters.